for Australians, but what about for those whose homeland was the location for the Gallipoli landing? Serpil Senelmis is an ABC Turkish Australian covering the centenary, and she joins us now from Anzac Cove. Serpil, really good to talk to you. I'd love to get your sense as a young Australian Turkish woman, what it's like to be in this place as we are marking their centenary with sort of that mixed emotion.
It's incredibly moving, and it's a real honour to be here because it's a place that symbolically for me brings together both my identities, both my nationalities, and it's something that I've straddled all my life, and it's the coming together of both those cultures. And for me, the story started back in the classroom when I was about 13 years old. My parents had brought me back to Turkey, and I learnt about the Great War of Çanakkale. And from there onwards, I started having an interest in the history, but later on, when I was 16 years old and living in Western Australia in Perth, the Turkish Culture of Ministry sent this statue of Atatürk to the Turkish Association there and asked us to gift it to Albany. So the entire association took the honour of taking this statue of Atatürk there, and it was there that I realised that the Anzac story and the Çanakkale War were the same campaign, and that my two identities were merged in that story.
So do both sides get a little distorted, and do both sides of course tell a very different story?
They do. When you're growing up in Australia, you get the Anzac perspective, the Australian perspective every year, but unfortunately you don't get the Turkish perspective a lot of the time. This is partly because there hasn't been very many Western books or Western literature that tell the Turkish perspective, and also the books have been closed up. The historical records haven't really been open to Westerners up until this time. But aside from that, the Turkish community in Australia are now feeling very confident in talking about the Turkish perspective. This year, for instance, there were art exhibitions, there were speeches, there were talks at cultural centres, there were friendship gatherings. So I think it's really heartening to see that Australia is now not only accepting but starting to also embrace a Turkish perspective as well.
Now, I noticed that there is a celebration of Turkish Children's Day, which sort of falls at this time. Tell us a little bit about that.
Turkish Children's Day is one of my favourite national days in Turkey because when you walk around you see little kids dressed in outfits, in costumes, traditional costumes, doing traditional folk dancing. They're reenacting great wars like Gallipoli. They're putting on little theatre pieces. It's a really significant day because it was gifted to the children by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the very first president of Turkey. It's a day that basically says to the Turkish children, you should take charge of your own destiny. It was to symbolically mark the end of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the formation of the Republic of Turkey, and also coincided with the first parliament sitting. And it was a message, a strong message to young Turkish people to say, you will now define your own history, you're an independent nation, and make the most of it.
And just briefly, Serpil, do the Turks celebrate Anzac Day in a different kind of way? How do they mark it?
They do celebrate it in a very different way. 25th of April, even though it's commemorated, for instance, this year, the 25th of April will be a huge deal for the Turks. There's about 25,000 people expected in the village of Bigali, which was where Atatürk had his headquarters during the Gallipoli campaign, and they're going to reenact a march that he actually did on the first day of the Anzac landings, going from Bigali all the way up to Chunuk Bair, which is the highest point here in the Gallipoli Peninsula, and he marched his particular infamous 57th Regiment up there to stop the Allies from taking the heights. But the main commemoration of Gallipoli is actually commemorated on the 18th of March because that's the day of the Dardanelles campaign. That was the day that a tiny little mine layer by the name of Nusret brought down 4 battleships and it was a huge success for the Turkish side of the campaign, and it's seen and marked as a great national victory each year, and it's a huge deal across the country.
Serpil, really great to get your insights. Thanks for joining us. To Malta now, where an interfaith funeral has been held for some of the victims of the Mediterranean Sea's worst ever disaster. 24 caskets containing the only bodies recovered so far were carried from the hospital morgue on the shoulders of Malta's armed forces along a route lined with bouquets of flowers. Government officials were joined by migrants